But one of the other questions that we sort of think about is, why does Luke end the story here? Why does he cut the story off so suddenly? Because it seems to be quite an anticlimax. It's like you're right into the middle of the story, and then all of a sudden it just stops. Now, there's different theories, even down to when Luke and Acts was written, and there's all sorts of different accounts and different theories as to when it might have been. The general consensus is that Luke writes his account after Paul's life, so maybe up in the 70s or even into the 80s. And the reason why we assume that is because Luke bases his gospel on Mark's gospel. Mark is a great sort of source of information for Luke, and so Mark is written probably in the 60s, and so Luke has to have at least come after Mark chronologically. So whenever the actual date was, we're not 100% sure, but certainly it's after the life of Paul. That's the general consensus about when this was written. Now, that raises the question then of what's Luke's motivation in writing this. Now, he tells us what his motivation is. At the beginning of Luke, and also again at the beginning of Acts, he addresses a certain Theophilus, who is the sponsor of this document. So this was an expensive task for Luke to have to do, not just to write it out and the cost of materials, but the time it would have taken to research and all of the gathering that Luke would have had to do to compile the story. That would have taken a lot of time, and somebody would have needed to support that. And so Theophilus seems to have been the guy who paid for this whole thing, and maybe for his own personal benefit. He probably wanted his own personal account. Maybe he's a rich guy who's become a Christian and now wants his own personal account of the life of Jesus and the story of the early church. That certainly seems to be at the core of what Luke's agenda is. But my suspicion would be, in the way that the church is portrayed and the way Jesus is portrayed, it's always portrayed in a way that not just some sort of in some hagiographical sort of way, and it's some hagiography of, oh, let's just tell Christians from their best possible side that they're perfectly innocent, and anytime something bad happens, it was always everybody else's fault, but these guys are flawless. Not so much that, but really to sort of give an account of the Christian story in a time where Christianity is facing persecution. By the time Luke's writing in the 70s and 80s, Christianity is definitely on the Roman radar, and it's increasingly persecuted. They've already been through the Neronian persecution, and it's sort of as a flow-on from that, Christianity is going to be marked out as something of a negative. Certainly, the way that they refuse to worship the emperor is something that's going to work against them. And so it's coming at a time when Christianity needs to be at least shown to be what it is. If you're talking about a second and third generation movement, you're getting people coming into the faith who don't know the original story. They probably weren't even alive when Jesus was around. And so they're part of this movement, but they're also hearing about its origins. Well, Jesus was crucified. That doesn't sound very good, because Romans don't crucify people that are good people. Well, sometimes they do, but that's not a great way to start a story. And Paul, who wrote all of these letters that we draw on as inspirational scripture, he was arrested and he was ultimately martyred under Nero. Now, just as a little side note, by the way, what actually happened to Paul? Because we don't know after this point. Paul was in prison for the next 2 years. What actually happened to the guy? Well, we know that he was martyred under Nero. So that has to have placed his death before the year 67, because in the year 68, Nero committed suicide. So the two assumptions are Paul was either martyred in 64, which is during Nero's persecution of the Christians after the fire of Rome. He blamed the Christians. He started persecuting. Peter was executed at that point. Paul traditionally has been martyred, was martyred at that point, or 67. So just in the time before Nero's death. Now, what that would presume is that Paul, in fact, got out of this imprisonment, and the tradition says that he did get to Spain and all of that happened. That's another story. But by the time of Luke's writing this, there are different accounts of Christianity, or there are elements of its origin story which can be taken the wrong way. That the fact that Jesus was crucified, the founder of it was crucified, and that Peter and Paul, both of them were martyred as well. They were killed as insurrectionists. That doesn't set you up very well. That can very easily be spun to be this is an insurrectionist movement. This is a terrible movement. And so what is, in my theory, my thought would be, my guess here is, and take it for what it's worth, is that what Luke is trying to do is to tell a new generation of Christians the origin story from up until the point where they know of. They know that Paul was martyred under Nero. They may not necessarily know why. As the message is spreading, as Christianity is spreading, that part of the story is not maybe necessarily being told. It's not as a fundamental part of what this Christianity is about. But there's rumors that Paul was martyred, and this is a bad thing. And so what Luke is trying to do is to give an account of what happened up until the point of that story. Now, it's interesting that you do this with movies, you do this with documentaries. In fact, I was just finished watching a documentary on Netflix about Donald Trump. Now, whatever you want to think about Trump, I don't necessarily care. It's just an interesting documentary. Everyone knows Trump as president, but most people don't know about his life. They might have heard bits and pieces, or they might have seen the name Trump through the 80s and 90s and even into the 2000s and 2010s. I mean, this guy's been around for a long time, but they don't know much about him. His story is, for those who are following him closely would know about him, but for the rest of the world, I grew up in the entire time that I was growing up, Donald Trump was this was somebody I didn't know. He was doing his thing, and he was becoming a very famous person throughout my lifetime, but I was not aware of him. I didn't know anything. I just heard bits and pieces from The Apprentice or all of that. But it wasn't until he became president that all of a sudden now everybody knows him. Now he's in every newspaper. He's in all the stories. Everybody knows Trump as president as of 2016, but no one really knows much about him before that. Who is this guy? Where did he come from? How did he become president in the first place? And so the way this documentary told the story was it goes back to his early life and his early business career, and it works his way through in his marriages, and it's a pretty damning story. It's not the best sort of story, but it's who he is, and so it's telling the story. And where it finishes off is he's about to make his run for the president. He's about to the circumstances that led up to his making a final decision to run for president in 2016, and that famous scene where he comes down the elevator at Trump Towers and he makes his announcement that I'm going to run for president. And then the documentary ends because everybody knows the story after that. What we don't know is the story leading up to it. And so who is this person? What is the truth behind this person? Good or bad, whatever you want to think about him, you know the spin, you know the story of him as president, but you don't know who the man was before that. And so I liken that to what's happening here with Luke. What Luke is trying to do with this story is everything leading up to, Paul, his martyrdom, and you know what happened after that. You're part of what happened as a result of Paul's martyrdom. You've now come into the church after that, and you've heard the story that Paul was martyred, but you don't necessarily know what led up to that. And I think the fact that Luke has spent so much time telling this story, trying to really drill down into the details of Paul's trial, so much more detail than anything else he's told in the rest of the gospel. There's more detail about Paul's trial than there is certainly about Jesus' trial, which is arguably a more important trial. So much detail about Paul's. You would have to say that Luke really wants to stress the fact that he's innocent. And so the way that he's told that story is to make it very clear for the generations that are going to come after him that yes, Paul was martyred, but not for the reasons that they'll have you think, that he was an innocent man all the way. And in fact, if you really want to read the spiritual element to this, what this created was an opportunity for Paul to preach to the emperor, that Paul actually had the opportunity to preach the gospel to Nero. And if you want to look at it that way, God maybe even orchestrated this story in Paul's trial in order to have that outcome.